YouTube. And I will start sharing my screen. Oh no, I forgot to X out of the live transcript so I don't have to see it. I hate reading my own text as it comes through because I just want to see what's wrong with it. Let's see, close, yes, hide subtitle, perfect. All right, great. And there is a cat meowing right near me, so we'll see if she decides to join me for this talk. Since it's only a few of us here and since it's like a group that like, I don't know, I feel like we kind of know each other from classes by now. This can be really like informal. So if at any point you want to jump in and like unmute or jump in and put things in chat, I have chat open. I'll try my best to answer questions as they come up and let this be more of a free flowing discussion rather than just like a lecture. But I have the material prepared if this does end up just being a 45-minute lecture. So this talk is about mixed methods research from home. That's kind of the idea of it, that I wanted to talk about how one can and how I have done mixed methods user research from home during a pandemic and how I think through research design, because I think that might be a handy thing to have some knowledge about before you start planning your thesis research project or as you start planning it anyway. So first of all, who am I? You've probably seen me before. In fact, I know you have because I'm in like all of your classes inadvertently. I'm Justin. I'm a PhD candidate here at UCD. I'm in my 4th-ish year of my PhD. Ben is my supervisor. As an undergrad, I studied psychology and cognitive science at Williams College, and it's a small college in America you may or may not have ever heard of. I was mostly interested in cognitive psychology there and the topic of attention and distraction, and that got me interested in those topics and more generally into human-computer interaction in general. I did a thesis there about essentially the use of speech interfaces, and I found them to be just like such a unique, weird type of HCI that maybe there wasn't a ton of work in at the time. It wasn't that long ago, it was like 2017, but it was like an up and coming kind of field that I was interested in staying involved in. While I was at Williams and into HCI and multitasking, I also had a chance to go to University College London and do some HCI research there. I met Duncan Brumby and Sandy Gould. Sandy gave the talk in UXD the other day, if you were there, the other day, meaning like 3 weeks ago. And I got to do some research with them, including some research on media multitasking. So that was why the first QDA question was about media multitasking. And I told them as I was finishing my undergrad that I really wanted to keep doing research and I really wanted to stay involved with multitasking and speech interfaces. And I said, I want to be a PhD student. They said, that's great. We don't know much about speech interfaces and we don't have funding for an American like you because, you know, Brexit was looming and it's still pretty bad over there with European funding. So they got me into contact with a guy they knew named Benjamin Cowan here in Dublin. And the rest was history. We hit it off. We decided to pitch a grant proposal about speech interfaces and media multitasking research. And that first grant was denied and we reworked it. And eventually I got funding from the ADAPT Center, a big old Science Foundation Ireland funded center that Ben's a part of. He's a PI, a principal investigator for. And now I'm working on my thesis under Ben and Professor Julie Bernson's supervision. And my thesis is all about the design of proactive agents, so speech agents that speak to you first and how they might interrupt us if they're the ones talking first. So that's me, but what is this talk about? So this talk's kind of in 4 parts. First, I want to talk about mixed methods research in general, kind of what it is and why we might do it. Then I want to talk about the research design process. How does one design a research study and how do I do that? How might you do that? Then I wanted to talk about my own experience in adapting a research design for a pandemic and how, you know, having your big grand ideas of research design, you can still keep a lot of those core ideas into something you can do from home during a pandemic. And finally, I kind of wanted to wrap it all the way back around to the idea of once we've done our mixed methods research, how do we present what we have? What do we get out of it? What do we have and how do we share it? So our first topic is mixed methods research. What is it? Why do we do it? So what is mixed methods research? Mixed methods is combining qualitative and quantitative data in a single piece of research where one wouldn't be enough on its own. So interactions with technology are really complex because there's human behavior involved, and human behavior is like really complex. You can look at it at a lot of different levels. You can look at a lot of different aspects of human behavior. So when we observe a phenomenon, when we observe a human-computer interaction event, there's a lot of different questions we could ask about it. And there's a lot of different data that we could measure depending on where our focus is set. Typically, we use quantitative data to test a hypothesis, to make a prediction and determine whether that prediction is supported by evidence or not. And we use qualitative data, on the other hand, to instead make those initial observations. So I put the scientific method wheel in my previous slide. I see qualitative data as our way to do that exploring, to make those observations. Quantitative data is our way to formulate and test a hypothesis. Now, sometimes we might want to do both. And why might we want to do both? And how might we want to do both? Well, let's imagine an experiment. So Green et al., this was a paper all about mixed methods research. They identified 5 rationales for using mixed methods approaches, 5 different reasons you might want to use it. So let's imagine an experiment and we'll go through 5 different reasons observing a particular phenomenon you might want to use mixed methods. So my idea for an experiment was we want to study whether taking notes on pen and paper is more or less effective than taking notes on an iPad on a tablet. Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely want to cover that it's not necessarily just that qualitative is like where you start and then you do a quantitative study based on it. So sometimes it's the other way around, and it's you test something, then you want to explain why. That your quantitative data tests maybe something like questions like what or how much, like how much does this affect this, or does that affect that? Whereas our qualitative data might test questions like how or why or for what reason. So I think you're absolutely right that it goes kind of both ways, that it's not that one comes before the other necessarily. But anyway, let's imagine our experiment where we want to test whether paper notes are more or less effective than notes on a tablet, on an iPad. So we might decide that we want to do a simple experiment. We bring people into the lab, they watch a recorded lecture. And some of the participants take notes on a tablet for one lecture and then take notes on paper, do it the other way around. And then we test how much they learned. So we might quantitatively give them a quiz right afterwards and measure the difference between their 2 quiz scores. We might also qualitatively ask them which note-taking method was more effective for you. In this way, we're using the 2 different streams of data. We're using qualitative and quantitative data to ask the same question, essentially, which is more effective. In this way, we're triangulating. We're using the different methods to test the same question and see if we get the same result. We might instead use complementary techniques. So we might ask different questions, but similar questions. So we might do that exact same experiment, but instead of asking people which method was more effective, we might just ask them more general questions about how they took their notes or what differed between the notes. That way we're getting a complement of data. We're asking both quantitatively which was more effective and qualitatively what were the differences between them. Now, we can get more broad from there. We could actually use one stream of data to develop our approach for collecting the other stream of data. Maybe before we even bring people into the lab, we start with interviews. We ask people the differences between the 2 note-taking styles. And maybe this gives us some insight. Maybe people say like, paper notes help me learn more if I have to write an essay about my notes later. Whereas if I don't have to, if it's just multiple choice, then it doesn't really matter. If that was our finding from our qualitative study, we might develop our quantitative study a little bit differently. We might decide that the way we want to test people is through an essay because that's what we found was important in our qualitative data. And that could work the other way around too. We might find some important detail through our quantitative data that teaches us how exactly we want to collect our qualitative data. We might also use one data stream as initiation or like a pre-screening of participants for the collection of the second stream of data. So it might limit which people we want to look at. So let's say we do that whole quiz thing and we found that most people did better with notes on the iPad than on pen and paper. But maybe we want to figure out what exactly it was about those pen and paper people that made pen and paper better for them. We want to only look at the subset that didn't fit our quantitative model. In this way, it's like we made a model that explained, X% of the variance. We made a model that said tablet is better than paper for X% of people. But now we want to look at the rest of the variance. We want to explore what factors might be in the residual variance, what other factors we might want to put into our model. That's my idea of what initiation would be anyway. Finally, you might really just ask completely different questions with your findings. And this is right along the lines of what Sushitra asked. Sorry, I really struggle with saying your name quickly because I talk so fast. No, this is exactly to that question that you can ask completely different questions with your data, and you might ask, you might start with observations from one study and then ask a completely different expansion of that with another study. So you might collect your, you might have everyone take their notes on pen and paper, do that lab study. And instead of even asking them interview questions, maybe we look at a thematic analysis of their notes. Maybe we want to explore for ourselves, like, what were some of the patterns in these notes? What were some of the themes that emerged? How did people write? In this way, we're asking completely different questions now. We're asking with our quantitative data, which was more effective? And with our qualitative data, like, what were these notes even like? In this way, it's kind of the exact opposite of triangulation, where we're asking the same exact question with both studies. Now we can ask completely different questions with both. Notice that in any of these cases, the purpose of mixed methods research isn't just presenting two sets of data. It's not just having two studies and like packaging them together in one paper. It's to actually mix them, to integrate the findings together and to tell a more nuanced story about your phenomenon. So like I said before, human-computer interaction, any interaction that involves human behavior is like really rich with data, really rich with all sorts of behavior going on. So if we have multiple streams of that data, multiple ways of analyzing that data, multiple questions we might be asking, we can tell a more nuanced story or a more confident story about our data. So has using two different methods to answer the same question ever yielded contrasting results? Absolutely. I would say that is kind of what that initiation step is about, that you might either find that you're only interested in people who were different than one set of your findings. That's like using one set of findings to find where that contrast might be. Or it might be in the triangulation or complementary kind of details where one of your studies, maybe your quantitative data, really finds something definitive on one variable and doesn't find stuff on another variable. Whereas in your interviews or in your qualitative data, people are really saying, no, that variable, even though you didn't find anything quantitative, that's really important to me, which might tell you have to go back and rework how you do your quantitative study. Or it might tell you that the variable you did detect is like so strong, it's masking effects of that other variable people are telling you about. And in fact, that's like exactly what happened to me. So when we get to my recent mixed methods study, I'll give an example of just that, of like contrasting answers and how we tell a story of contrasting data. So now we have a little bit of an idea of what mixed methods research might be used for, but there's still a lot of details to iron out about how we design a study. How do we get from a research question or a hypothesis down to the details of like exactly what people are going to be doing in the lab or what we want to ask people in interviews or whatever. So we are designing our study, but which part comes first, the quantitative or the qualitative? Well, it depends on your goals. So if you're using mixed methods because you want to narrow the focus of your study, you want these convergent, complementary results. In this case, you might decide to use a convergent design. You might collect both streams of data at the same time and then see if they are saying the same things, essentially. You could also use a convergent design if you're looking to use your data to expand, to ask completely different questions, that it might be this data and this data are answering completely different questions, and we piece it together, we mix them in our discussion, in our interpretation of the results, but it's okay that they're collected separately. On the other hand, I gave those examples of using one set of data to decide how you're going to collect or what data you're going to collect in the other stream. This might be a good time to use a sequential design. So there's two different types of sequential design in these diagrams here that I'm kind of mapping out. The first is an explanatory sequential design. So this is when you get your quantitative findings and then seek to understand a bit more about why you found what you found. So that's exactly what we were talking about in like the note-taking example, where you get your study, you figure out which side did better. Essentially, like you figure out maybe paper notes did way better. And now you want to ask that why question. So now we maybe we'll just interview people who fit that general trend, and we ask them, why were paper notes so much better for you? Or maybe we just interview people on the other side and ask why were tablet notes so much better? In this case, if you think the way that you're collecting data for one of the streams really depends on what you found in the previous stream, that's where an explanatory sequential design is going to come in handy, because you can really tailor exactly what you're trying to explain through a sequential design. Alternatively, you might take an exploratory design, and the classic example of this is prototyping. So if you were like designing an app or a website, you might start with like no good idea of what this app or website should look like. So maybe you start with qualitative data. Maybe you start with like interviews or think aloud, focus groups, something like this, where you're getting input from the people who might use that technology about how it should be designed. So you get your qualitative data, you figure out how this app or website should be designed, and then you prototype it, you build it. Then you can do a quantitative study with that thing that you built. You could test if it achieves whatever goal you were looking for, if it increases engagement or improves accessibility or whatever. And this is why you might need a sequential design. You wouldn't have known what factors to change or to what design principles to use for this website without doing that qualitative step first. Finally, not pictured here, the diagram was like enormous, so I couldn't fit it on a slide and make it look nice, but you might do an embedded intervention design. So this is like starting one stream of data, and then before you finish that study, before you finish collecting that data, you launch a different stream of data, you launch a different study, and finish that and change something about that first stream. So what do I mean by this? So maybe you're testing a website, maybe you roll out your website and you take some baseline quantitative measurements. You take engagement, like how much time people are spending on the site, how many links they're clicking, things like this. You get your first quantitative reading. Then before you take another quantitative reading, you launch a qualitative study. You interview people, or you have a focus group or whatever, and you ask them, what about this website are you liking? What would increase engagement? Things like that. You run your full qualitative study, analyze that data, figure out what people want improved, and you do that intervention. You make that change to the website. You increase and you add whatever design elements you think would increase engagement, and then you measure again. You see if that intervention worked. So in this way, you might run kind of both streams, one within the other, a nested or an embedded approach. And that might also be a way that you want to collect mixed methods data. So how do you figure out what order you put your studies in? Well, it's all about asking yourself what your research questions are, and asking yourself whether the analysis of one set of data impacts the design or the collection of the other set of data. So that's all a lot of detail about how you like orient and order your studies, but it's still not a lot of detail about like how to pick what people are doing in the lab or what sorts of questions you're asking people. And this is where I really make use of a book that I was introduced to as an undergrad. This is called The Multitasking Mind by Dario Salvucci and Niels Totgen. This was a book about multitasking in HCI, but the first couple chapters of it are just about HCI in general and about like how we design studies in HCI. And I find this book like incredibly useful every time I'm trying to design a study, because it asks you to think about your study, asks you to think about research across a number of like spectrums or continua. So the first continuum I want to talk about is the application continuum. This is the idea of how applied or theoretical your interaction is. So let's take an example that Salvucci and Totgen use. They give a bunch of examples, but one task they want to look at is phone calls. So if you're imagining the most applied version of a phone call that you could possibly like measure in a lab, that you could possibly do research on, this is just the most ecologically valid version of a phone call. It's just a real phone call, no modification from the researcher, no intervention, no experimental control. You might you might just log actual phone calls. So maybe it's a company that wants to study how their customer service team's phone calls work. And they just record phone calls for like a week and analyze that data. They just listen to the recordings or transcribe the recordings and do whatever analysis they want on it. This would be extremely ecologically valid because this is like the actual phenomenon you're trying to get at, these customer service phone calls. But there's not a lot of experimental control in this really applied version of a phone call. You can't ask causal questions. You can't set conditions for a dependent variable, an independent variable, and you can't make specific scenarios of interest happen. So maybe this company wants to know how their customer service staff handles people placing an international order, or how they handle a deaf customer calling. If you just monitored your phone calls for a week, there's no guarantee you have that exact scenario that you want in your data set. So instead, if you needed more control, if there was something specific you wanted to test, you might opt for a less applied version of the same interaction. So maybe you go for a scripted phone call. Maybe you recruit some of your customer service staff to participate in these scripted calls where an actor plays the role of a customer and they have specific goals for the call. In this case, there's less certainty that your findings will be exactly like the real world, the fully applied context. But now you have certain questions and scenarios that you know will apply to your data set. You have certain conditions you can set. You could say that all of the actors will have a particular accent or be of a particular gender or age. This way you can have dependent variables and you can actually make causal predictions. You might instead, maybe this is even too applied though, you might even decide for something less applied, a laboratory task, what you'll sometimes see referred to as like basic psychology. This is like super controlled, but not very ecologically valid. A lot of context gets stripped away from the real world application, from the real idea of a phone call in this case. And it might be because we think there's a lot of confounding variables that you want to look at something in specific, but when you have the full phone call, it gets masked by all these other variables because a phone call is just such a complex interaction. So maybe the company is studying phone calls and they think that people with a particular regional accent are getting lower quality service than those with other regional accents. So maybe it's a company in Ireland and they realize that their customers in Northern Ireland have like way lower satisfaction with the customer service team. Maybe they start to suspect, oh, maybe our customer service staff just don't like people from Northern Ireland. They don't like the accent, and that's putting them in a bad like headspace for the call or something. To test something like this is where like a basic laboratory task, like a linguistic task, could help you get at that variable and abstract away all of the other kind of details about a phone call. So maybe you just have your customer service staff listen to recorded voices and rate which ones are like more pleasant or more comprehensible or something, to see if accent alone, like that as your only variable, has a big effect on your customer service staff. That's just kind of a wacky example I came up with, but this is kind of the idea of a really low level of application to get at a really specific variable. So how do we choose which level of application we want our study to be at? How do we choose if it's going to be a laboratory task or somewhere in the middle or real world data? Again, we kind of need to start with our research question, with our hypothesis. Maybe there are certain questions that if we don't have the full details, if we don't have the full real world application, we just won't be able to answer them. Or maybe we need some control because there's a specific variable we want to test. Maybe we need lots and lots of control because there's like too much context in the full version. We want to look at some key component. In any of these cases, it's also important to consider the resources available to us. So Salvucci and Totgen also give the example of driving. For your MSc thesis in particular, and particularly during a pandemic, it's not super likely that if you wanted to study driving as like an HCI context, it's not particularly likely that you're going to get like ethics clearance and get the equipment to measure like on-road actual like in the wild driving. We're probably not going to have you like riding the Dublin bus and like measuring something about how it drives all day. But you might be able to do something a little less applied. Maybe you'll be able to use driving around a closed course or using a driving simulator. In fact, we do have a driving simulator in ICS that I got with my research budget, never got to use. I would love if someone eventually used it and it wasn't just a complete missed opportunity. But maybe that's even too applied. Maybe you're only interested in driving because you want to know if like talking on the phone while driving impacts your driving ability. So you're not even that interested in the driving. You're just seeing if talking on the phone distracts people. In that case, maybe you can pick just some other task. Like they give the example of manual tracking. So like keeping your eye on a circle as it moves around a screen. Maybe something like that would be like a good enough stand-in for driving for what you're interested in. But it all depends what exactly you're interested in. It depends what your research question is. So another of the continua that Salvucci and Totkin use in their research design guidelines is the abstraction continuum. So just like we would abstract away or have the full picture of certain details in terms of how applied a task is, there's also consideration of like human behavior and what aspects of behavior we're interested in. So when people are conducting a behavior, it's really complex. Human behavior, there's a lot going on there. And you're not trying to study every single all-encompassing part of a phenomenon. That would be way too much. Human behavior is far too complex to look at all of it. Whenever you're doing any kind of research, you're not trying to present the phenomenon itself. You're trying to present a model of it. You're trying to present a smaller kind of abstracted, certain details are ignored, certain details are maintained. That way you can kind of make sense and tell the story of the phenomenon without presenting all of it, all of the chaos and noise and unimportant details. So Alan Newell, one of the forefathers of HCI as like a scientific discipline, described this fundamental richness of human behavior in saying that human behavior exists along a time scale of actions, that we can look at human behavior in different bands or different levels of action, ranging from how long a different behavior takes and ranging on in how much like intention and how much conscious like decision making is going on at that level. So let's look at for our four kind of bands, our four time scales of action. We can think back to our study about phone calls and give an example at each of these levels for a phone call. So at the smallest time scale of action, this is called the biological band by Salvucci and Totkin. This is the idea of just modeling humans as like biological beings, not even thinking about decision making, just thinking about like stimulus and response essentially. So we might, for our phone calls, look at which phonemes people use, which like word sounds, like whether, I don't know, for my particular regional accent, instead of saying water or water, I say water. So those are different like word sounds that I'm not consciously deciding which one that I use, but that's part of my speech. It's at the millisecond level. It's something really kind of hyper specific that's lower than the level of conscious intention. And it might be something that we're interested in if we're looking at phone calls. But maybe instead we're not interested in word sounds. We're interested in words, which words people use, or like how many questions they ask on a call. Maybe our level of analysis isn't like the sounds within a word, but it's each word in a sentence or each like utterance. At this case, we're talking about the cognitive band. We're talking about data that takes place over the course of seconds rather than milliseconds. At this level, we are seeing people as cognitive decision makers, that we attribute like some level of intention to their actions, that people choose which words they are using or choose which how many questions they're going to ask. We might instead go even a level higher than this. We might look at, instead of the word or the sentence, we might say our unit of analysis, the smallest piece of data we're looking at is an entire phone call. At this, and instead of looking at the little subtasks, instead of looking at, oh, my internet connection is unstable. I hope that holds up. Instead of looking at the subtasks like sentences or words, we're looking at what we might consider a full task, a full thing that a human has like a plan, a strategy, an overarching like goal for. So we might ask questions like, how long is a typical phone call, or how many calls does an employee take? That people don't make like a single decision about a phone call, but they might have a set of strategies that they use throughout the phone call. It's this rational band, this strategizing rather than decision making, that we're modeling human behavior at this level. Finally, the most kind of broad, long time scale band is the social band. So this is things that take place over days or weeks or months or years. This might be asking customer service employees like how they feel about phone calls in general, or what they identify as key skills for taking phone calls. We're not looking at any specific task at this level. We're looking at the broader like reflection on the job. We're not looking at individual decision making. We're looking at like feelings, reflection, like social meaning making in the phenomenon rather than at the level of decision making. So what does this mean for you? I hope this sort of demonstrates that human phenomenon, human behavior, any kind of interaction is just so rich with details that you can look at any different level. And you need to think about what exact level is relevant to your research question. That when you select one level of analysis, one unit of analysis, those other parts probably aren't that relevant to you. If you're studying phonemes, you probably don't care about the person who's speaking's like workplace satisfaction. Or if you're asking about workplace satisfaction, you don't care which phonemes they're using. Deciding which data matters to you and whether you want to look at humans as biological beings or cognitive decision makers or rational planners or as social like people in the world, that's going to determine what model you're making for your data, what story you're telling, how you're presenting your social science research, whether it's human-computer interaction research or any other sort of social science research. So that leads me into my own studies. So I'll tell you about my own experience trying to apply what I've told you about so far and trying to adapt research to the pandemic. So as I said, my PhD focuses on interruptions and multitasking. Oh no, why does the slide not have my fun little GIFs? Let me see if I can make them. Oh man, that's sad. Well, back to presenter view. There should be 2 GIFs going there. They were working just before the talk. So I had one GIF of a driving simulator and another of real life driving videos. And now the slides aren't even loading, but I'll keep talking. So my PhD focuses on interruptions and multitasking with conversational interfaces. And I see this, oh, my GIFs are back. I see this as a key kind of consideration for technology of the near future and how we keep people safe when they interact with computers like autonomous vehicles or like industrial robots that you might be like working alongside. So originally my first experiment was going to involve a driving simulator just like this one. This is not my picture, but this is my driving simulator. I planned to have like a member of the lab pretending to be a participant. They were going to be Confederate in the experiment, and they were going to operate the driving simulator while a participant interrupted them with questions or with messages, just like a passenger in a car might talk to the driver while they're driving. I wanted to record audio and video of this interaction and measure how much the difficulty of the drive affected the quality of the drive, and how the difficulty of the drive impacted the way that my participants spoke to the driver, whether they, if someone was going around a tight corner, whether they like said things differently or waited in how they spoke, things like that. In terms of application, this was somewhere near the middle. This isn't like actual on-road driving, but it's a simulated drive, and it's making use of like ecologically valid videos. So these are actual driving videos recorded by a colleague of mine in London. Well, I guess this is in the London suburbs. London is not this green and residential, but this is actual on-road driving videos. And we're going to tell participants that the person using driving simulator was playing a game where they had to match the exact same patterns and driving as the person who had recorded the videos. So I had this all set up for as far as levels of abstraction go. I was interested in like the cognitive and rational band. So I'm interested in the decision making and how exactly people time each interruption. And I was interested in the overarching strategy, whether people time their interruption and speak a little differently for hard videos and hard driving moments as compared to easier driving moments. So yeah, I had all my videos made, selected, clipped up. My speech scripts were all written up. My driving simulator was set up in the lab. I had someone ready to be the fake driver. I had ethical approval from the Human Research Ethics Committee. It was March of 2020. And then COVID happened really big and really bad, made me go all the way back to the drawing board, that I couldn't bring participants into the lab for that study anymore. So I had to think about what the bare essentials of my experiment were. I wanted to test that same fundamental research question. What do human-human spoken interruptions look like in terms of timing and content? when you're interrupting someone who's doing another task, but I couldn't measure those in the way that I had planned. I had to abstract that study down to its key features and figure out what I could keep, what I needed to do this research, and what factors were actually just miscellaneous details that I could abstract away. So I came up with some must-haves for my experiment, like having a primary task that's something like driving, that it's continuous. So if you look away from it, the task keeps going on. You can't like pause the task by not interacting with it. I wanted the task to be like a hands busy, eyes busy task, because that's what I had identified as like the primary use case for speech. I have some of these other things here. I wanted people to be able to do the task at home. I wanted that the way you're interrupting them to be speech rather than like hitting a button or something. Then I also had to consider the resources available to me. I was in my bed sit in Dublin. I didn't want to have to wake up at odd hours if participants were suddenly available for me at like 3 in the morning. I wanted something that I could just put online, have people go interact with. I could take my hands off and just come back when the data was ready for me. So I wanted something that I could code on like JS-Psych, which is a JavaScript library, or PsychoPy, a Python library. That way I could actually like code it up myself. I wanted to make it something that was suitable for crowd workers so that I could just put online and have other people like participate in. And I wanted it to be something that could be plausibly faked, that if I showed my actual driving videos in some online study, I just couldn't come up with a story that I could tell people like, oh, there's somebody actually driving right now and you're interrupting them. No one was going to believe that. So I had to come up with a different sort of task that people might actually believe someone was engaging in. And what I came up with was Tetris. So I built a little online paradigm involving the game Tetris. In my mind, it's actually a lot like driving. It involves visual attention from the player. It involves manual control. It involves a lot of quick decision making. It's continuous. You can't really make it stop. It just keeps going if you don't interact with it. But it's a lot more easily represented online than something like driving. Instead of a real person operating a driving simulator, I made these pre-recorded videos so I could tell my participants that they were watching another person playing Tetris, just like in the driving simulator study. And it was easy enough for me to code up onto in JavaScript on JS-Psych and put it on Mechanical Turk. I made it so like tasks were, people wanted to avoid error. I told them they would like win a cash prize if the person who they were interrupting played really well. And I just had them play through a bunch of trials of this. They asked their partners questions like, how's the weather, or what's your favorite color, while their fake partner, these recorded videos, played Tetris. And I had this idea of having a bonus prize contingent on your partner's score based on some research by Landesberger and colleagues. They were doing work on something like this, on interruptions and like speaking to a partner. And they found that, yeah, if you just tell participants that like some turns are urgent, they speak a lot differently than if you tell participants that it's not urgent. And you can modify how urgent something is by telling them you get more money when it's urgent. So I basically did just that. I wanted to compare how my urgent conditions were as compared to my non-urgent conditions, whether people spoke differently, whether they timed their speech differently and said different things. And I wanted to collect mixed methods data here. So I got some quantitative data that looked like this. To me, an interruption looks like this waveform here, where it's like a burst of sound just in the middle of a recording. And I turned that into graphs. I had a couple of hypotheses about like quantitative differences in speech depending on urgency. So I was guessing that people would start speaking like right away, start speaking quicker when it was an urgent interruption. I guessed that people would speak for a shorter amount of time, that they would say things really fast when it was an urgent interruption. And I had this idea that they would use less social language. I use this term access rituals. So that's things like saying or hey, or saying a person's name before speaking to them. I thought people would not do that so much when things were urgent, but maybe they would actually be more social and polite when things were not urgent. On the bottom half of the slide, you can see my tricolor Irish pride graph, where I'm visualizing one of my findings, that people did in fact speak a lot sooner when the interruption was urgent. I have some models there that they're essentially regression models. You can see that the p-value is too high, that I didn't find anything significant for interruption duration or for these access rituals for this social speech. So if I had only done quantitative data here, if I had only done this as my study, I might have concluded that urgency makes people speak faster or interrupt sooner, but it doesn't impact how long they speak for, or it doesn't impact how they speak in terms of like being polite or social. Luckily for me, that's not what I did. I didn't only collect quantitative data, I also collected some qualitative data. After the whole experiment, I asked all of my participants some open-ended questions. I asked them things like, what was your strategy for timing in each condition? And what was your strategy for how you spoke in each condition? And people described interrupting in a lot of different ways. I had this big, long mess of paragraphs that everyone wrote me about their experience in interrupting. So to bring some order to that data, to model that phenomenon, I used thematic analysis, a qualitative analysis technique. And I generated some themes that describe the different strategies that people told me about. So I found that people, they ended up either trying to interrupt as quickly or as soon as possible. They tried to prioritize their speed, or they tried to speak in ways that they thought would interrupt in less disruptive ways that were less likely to cause errors, that were more prioritizing like their partner's accuracy. And I found that some people used characteristics of the Tetris game, like where the piece was or like what it was doing, or maybe content of the message. So maybe some questions they thought, I can ask that really fast, so I'll go ahead and ask it. And other questions they thought, that's a little too complicated. I'll wait until it's a good moment to ask that. Likewise, for how they phrased how they structured their interruptions, I found some differences in how they phrased and delivered their interruptions based on the two different conditions. So in this way, I actually found that people did think that they had some differences in both how quickly, how long their interruption lasted, like how many words and how quickly they spoke, and also how social they were being, how polite they were being. In this way, I would have, if I only had done the qualitative side of things, I would have said all of my predictions were correct. These conditions are both urgency has a really strong effect on how much people talk or how soon they interrupt and whether they're social and polite. So if I had only done this side of the data collection, I would have had a completely different set of findings than if I had only done the quantitative side. So how do I blend that together? How do you tell the story of mixed methods research? So I'll tell you how I did it, and then I'll give some general musings on how one ought to tell that story. So how did I tell this story of maybe contrasting or conflicting results? Well, I took a step back and I went back to that pyramid diagram and I thought about what exactly I was using mixed methods to tell me. In my case, I was using mixed methods to ask similar research questions. I wanted my results to complement each other and to help explain what spoken interruptions were like. I was essentially asking the same question with two different sets of data. What I found was a pretty complex picture. In some ways, my findings converged on certain answers. So I found that people did, in fact, interrupt sooner. They did say they interrupted sooner when an interruption was urgent. And because I found this convergence, because my two methods said the same thing, I could be more confident stating that this is what a spoken interruption is like between people. And I could also recommend to people who are designing proactive speech agents that if you want your speech agent to interrupt in the same way that a person does, I'm pretty darn sure people interrupt sooner, they wait less time when interruptions are urgent. This is an actual kind of concrete insight that a designer could use. They could say, okay, if it's a not so urgent interruption, maybe the speech agent can wait for a good moment. If it's urgent, just speak right away. And I could only kind of make that recommendation because my findings converged in that way, because I could be really confident that this is what human behavior is like. As for those other two variables, as for my other factors, I found those contrasting pieces of evidence between my two different methods. I therefore have to tell a pretty nuanced story about these questions. We're not quite sure how interruption duration and social factors manifest for spoken interruptions. People mention them, but I don't find those results quantitatively. Maybe people don't have much conscious access for what they're doing and they're reporting something that they're not actually doing. Or maybe people are reporting things correctly and it just doesn't show up because other effects are masking that. Maybe there's other variables that I'm not seeing. Or maybe there's big individual differences and I'm not measuring something like social factors in the right way. So when I tell the story of this data, I express uncertainty. I express mixed findings. I express that there was a contrast. It might make it sound like my intention to use these data streams to complement each other didn't work, but that's not how I see it. I see it actually is a big success, that if I had used one method or the other method alone, I would have gotten findings that don't really match what I found by combining them. I'm more confident that what I found is a good model of a phenomenon because I collected different sorts of data about it. My mixed methods results allow me to paint a more nuanced picture of my finding. They make it more clear for me what my next study or studies should look like and how exactly I should go about designing those studies. So in general, if that's how I tell my story, I hope it's a general way for you to think about how to tell your story of mixed methods data, how we can collect data and report about a model that describes a phenomenon. And of course, I wanted to remind you that mixed methods research is not just carrying out two studies, reporting them both independently. It's mixed from data collection to data reporting and to how you tell your story, to how you present your model, how you tell a clean, logical story about a rich phenomenon of human behavior that's going to have lots of data and noise and chaos. If we use mixed methods data, we can better answer questions of what or how much or whether alongside questions of why or how in a single piece of research. We can seek to keep humans at the center of our research and understand people as decision makers and planners or strategists, people with goals and objectives, but also people with feelings and emotions, because we have different sets of data coming in to describe what people are like. So what did we cover today? Hopefully the 4 goals we set out to cover. Hopefully I've convinced you that mixed methods research is useful. It's a good way to build models of our world, and that we can do that by designing studies, maybe by using some of the continua that I shared with you, or at least through thinking through what characteristics of our research are crucial and which details can be abstracted away. I try to do that by demonstrating my own experience in doing that through the pandemic. And I hope that that can be a template for you in designing your own thesis experiments. And finally, I tried to impart one last time that mixed methods research is mixed in its design and its data collection and its presentation of results and the story it tells and the model that it builds. I wanted to really solidify that way of thinking about research as a process by which we observe a complex, messy world and we build a model around it. We tell a story about it so we can better understand our world. So that's it for my talk. I hope there's some questions. I know I rambled a bit at the beginning, so I might have taken up some question time, but I don't have anything on after this, so I'm happy to chat for as long as anyone wants. And I thank you very much for your attention throughout.
Hey, Justin, I have a question.
Oh, thanks, Diego.
So you talked about mixed methods for your PhD project.
Yep.
But is it too complicated for something like a MSc thesis project?
I'm glad you asked. What an ingenious question, Diego. You're so smart and handsome. Yes, no, I think mixed methods is really appropriate and really makes for good MSc projects. I was involved in the supervision of a couple of MSc projects last year and in the past couple of years. And yeah, some of the really excellent pieces of work that people have done in their MSc project has been those like convergent design mixed method studies where you're maybe asking the same questions with both methods, with both data streams, but you're able to present a more complex, nuanced model of things. So last year, it was just after I had published my Tetris study. Someone wanted to put a twist on that Tetris study. They wanted to see I was involved in a couple of people who wanted to put a twist on that. When someone wanted to see if having a speech agent or having a partner that like stuttered or asked you to repeat yourself, if having like errors in the system would make people speak differently. So they did essentially the Tetris thing, but sometimes there was errors. Sometimes the person said, sorry, I didn't hear you, or like they would answer the question weirdly, and sometimes they wouldn't. And they did a really similar mixed methods design to what I did. And I thought the thesis turned out really well, that they were able to present lots of cool like explanatory information through their qualitative data. And they were also able to test a hypothesis of whether or not those errors, whether or not like verbal repair made people speak differently. So I think that's definitely something you can fit into a master's thesis. And I think it can make for like really high quality work. Like actual publishable work. I think that thesis was a great example of a paper we could have asked the student, like, hey, do you want to try to publish this? Because I think there would have been a good chance that it gets published. Would the thesis project, if the scope involve a single person? Yeah, so this thesis project, I have the recording on. So I will say the thesis project I mentioned technically was a pair of students, though it is my understanding that one member of the pair might have done more work than the other to the level that it was basically like one person doing it alone. I think if you're motivated to do that analysis, you can do it solo. I would also say if you have a pretty clean analysis plan going in, like if you have either maybe using like one set of data and analyzing it two different ways would be a way to simplify that process for yourself, or using a replication study. That would be a really good way to simplify your analysis. So that's what this student did, since she was doing something really similar to my Tetris study. She replicated not only a lot of the materials, so I gave her a lot of my code so she could run the Tetris study on Mechanical Turk, but I also gave her kind of my analysis plan so she knew exactly how to do the quantitative analysis. There wasn't a lot of like wasted time in doing that. And then she obviously still had to do the qualitative analysis on her own because it was fresh data. But you can simplify things. You can get that done on your own. So Echo says, I'm not as lucky as you. I can't find any common results in the two tests. I need to go back to the beginning and redesign the experiments. Do we redesign both experiments, or do we only redesign one? How do we know which one we need to redo? So that's a really good question. I would say it's not, how do I phrase this? It's not a failure. It's not an unpublishable result to find contrasting evidence. In fact, it's often an even better study if you do find contrasting evidence. So there's a paper, Yunhan in our lab, who you all know from UXT or from QDA by now. She had a paper in CUI, Conversational User Interfaces conference a couple of years ago now, where she had something like 7 or 9 hypotheses, and I think like all of them were not supported, or like 7 of them were not supported. And it wasn't that this paper is unpublishable because we didn't find the evidence we expected. It was actually publishable, and like it was a pretty popular paper at the conference that year because we made all of these predictions based on the literature, based on things that we really thought were true about the behavior she was observing, and like none of them were true. So finding these surprising results or finding contrasting results doesn't necessarily mean we need to go back and redesign something. Often telling the story of like, this is what I expected, this is what I didn't find it, here's some reasons why I didn't find it. Like that's a great paper on its own. But if I was to go redesign one or the other study in that case, I think that's actually a great place to use qualitative data as an explanatory tool. So maybe I'm really surprised I made these predictions, I didn't find them at all. Maybe that's actually a great time I can go back and use explanatory qualitative data like interviews and ask people like, oh, I didn't find that, like I expected that people would say please or excuse me or whatever before speaking, and I didn't find that. So maybe I'll ask a participant like, oh, you always went right into speaking without saying hey or excuse me first. Is there a reason you didn't do that? Do you do that in other contexts? I would generally say if you're looking to like get a why answer, qualitative data is the way to go. So adding like an extra qualitative step might be the right solution there. Sophie asks, this might be too broad of a question, but what kinds of quantitative analysis did you use for this research? I'm very interested in seeing how some of the tests we've been talking about in QDA are used in real world experiments. No, this is an awesome question. I didn't want to get into it if no one wanted to hear it, but I'm actually really happy to share. Diego, or I think officially Ben is listed as the person who's going to teach about mixed effects models, but I think Diego is the expert as well. So either of them might be leading that talk. I used a mixed effects model here. So the idea of a mixed effects model is it's a lot like a regression model. It's a lot like the idea of making predictions, using variables to make predictions about another variable, except a mixed effects model, where a regression model assumes that the conditions will have the same effect for everyone. So in my case, if I did a regression model, it would assume that every single participant has the same difference in when they speak, depending on whether they were in the high or low urgency condition. It assumes that that difference is consistent across all people. But of course, you might expect that there's big individual differences, that that's not going to be the case. It might not even be the case question to question, that people might ask, if they're urgently asked to say, you know, what's your favorite color? That might be different than urgently asking, what time is it right now? So you might have individual differences at the participant level, at the individual person level, or you might have them at the trial level, at the material level. This is what mixed effects models help us model out. It doesn't assume that those effects for your main variable, your main fixed effect, your variable of interest, it doesn't assume that that's the same across all people or across all trials. It actually lets it vary on a per person and a per trial level. So you get maybe slightly less easily visualized or slightly less easily conceptualized models. But I think you get models that explain your data a lot better and that make better assumptions about like differences in your data. This isn't something we taught in QDA because it gets a little bit involved, but it's something, as I said, Ben and or Diego will be leading a masterclass about next term. And any of us are like really happy to talk about. It's something we use a lot in this lab and like that we're secretly obsessed with. So if you read like a lot of my papers, a lot of Diego's papers, a lot of Ben's recent quantitative papers, Yunhan's papers, all of us are like using these mixed effects models and like super into it. So they might give you a basis for like seeing how they're used. Awesome, great. Yeah, no, I know I love talking about mixed effects models. We even have, we have a channel in like our lab Slack called like mixed effects model chat, where it's just like asking each other like nerdy, weird questions about like, oh, how do I make this assumption happen in the model? So we are all very happy to talk about those some more. I actually, when in the exemplary master's thesis I was talking about, right near the end of the year, so probably in like beginning of August, the student who was working on that was like, oh, I realized like there's huge individual differences, but I'm using a regression model. Can I like, what should I do about those? I was like, well, it's August. I'm happy to teach you mixed effects models, and like told her some of the basics of them. But I'm also happy for you to say in your limitations, like, oh, there's probably individual differences that were not modeled here. And she was like, yeah, if I asked you like 2 months ago, I would have wanted to do the mixed effects models, but now it's way too close to submission. I will just include that in my limitations, which is also like perfectly valid. There's lots of like published papers that use regression models, and then as a limitation say, you know, we didn't capture differences between individuals or between trials. I'll hang on the line in case anyone else has questions or things they want to talk about with this, because as I said, like I don't have anything else planned after this. I know if you have class or like somewhere better to be, like I don't want to keep you, but happy to chat more. Are you planning to go back to driving, or are you now married to Tetris? Yeah, unfortunately, if you had asked me last spring, maybe the end of last spring, I would have still said, yeah, I really want to go back to driving. I think that's like the critical use case here. Maybe I want to like climb the ladder of application. So I want to say, all right, we did Tetris, now we'll do like lo-fi driving simulator, like a driving video game. Then when we can finally be back in person, we'll do the actual driving simulator. But the clock just kept ticking. So I just don't see a time that I'll be able to use the driving simulator. And now I have the rest of my studies either like in progress or data already collected using Tetris. But I'm happy to see, I attended a conference called Automotive User Interfaces a couple of months ago. And apparently a lot of people in the driving HCI field are facing this similar problem of like, I can't go bother actual drivers. I can't even use my simulator. And at least 2 other people have turned to Tetris. So I'm not the only person in this field crazy enough to think that Tetris is basically a driving simulator. Well, I think think that might be it if Diego's just asking me the questions that I already wrote at this point. So I thank all of you for coming. I will put this this whole talk. Oh yeah, great. Once we form our thesis research questions and we're designing experiments, yeah, please. No, I'll definitely be involved in like advising like anyone who wants help, and I'll be involved probably as a co-supervisor in some of your in at least one or two theses, maybe more than that, depending on what exact topic you end up with. So yeah, if you have like research design questions or modeling, like statistical modeling questions, or like any kind of questions, I'll probably also be the tutor in research methods in the spring. So you'll never actually be free of me. And yeah, I'm always available to talk about anything about research design and stuff like that. So I'll be looking forward to talking more to you. And yeah, thanks again for coming to this talk. I'll have it on YouTube, and you can always go back to it while you're getting your thesis ready.